Hello, I'm Notes, and it's October, so I figured let's have a look at some of the more spooky and dark albums that were released this year, starting with, pause for effect, friggin' Opeth. Man, I friggin' love Opeth. They are arguably the biggest name in progressive death metal. Much like Tool, these guys have made their name on fan base alone. You really can't hear them on the radio. Their songs really don't lend to that kind of a medium. But you do hear them through word of mouth, or at least now on the internet. And these guys really deserve the praise that they got. I mean, they were one of the first progressive death metal bands, able to blend the death metal growls with more of like a progressive rock medium. Songs stretching into the 10-20 minute mark with very long instrumental interludes. And sometimes the interludes would bleed into a new interlude. Some have argued that these guys were kind of a progressive rock first and then a death metal band. And for me, at least when they first started off, they were kind of a death metal first and then just happened to be playing more of a progressive rock kind of a technique. So they started in the mid-90s and they've really progressed each album through. They've been able to reinvent their style time and time again, but still kind of maintain that Opeth style, that Opeth identity. Even the artists that play on the albums tend to rotate around and around. I think the only one that's left from the original lineup is, I never am able to pronounce his name, so I'm going to refer to him as Michael. Ecclefelt. I always end up pronouncing it Ecclefart. I'm sorry. The one thing they've been able to maintain throughout this entire thing is their identity. With that identity, it's a rich musicianship with really dark moods, really dark themes. Even on those songs that aren't the death metal growls, it's still very dark. So why am I talking about Opeth? Well, they released a new album this year, Pale Communion. Before I completely gush about this album, I do need to talk about the process leading up to this album. Opeth put out Heritage. This split a lot of fans. For one, it didn't have the death metal growls, but unlike Damnation, it also didn't quite feel like Opeth. In fact, when recording Heritage, Michael had been saying that he had recorded 2 straight-up death metal songs that sounded a lot like what was already on the albums. And after recording the demos, he just deleted them. He wasn't satisfied with them, and then he decided just to write what he wanted to hear. And that's what Heritage was. For me, Heritage was the band stepping out of that death metal box that they had put themselves into for over 20 years and survey the land. Really take a look at what else is there to Opeth if they just remove themselves from the death metal box. And you still got those deep, rich sounds, those deep, moving, and complex time signatures, the complex guitar riffs. All of my musician friends love this album because it's so rich and so clear. The one thing that, at least for me, that Heritage was lacking was direction. It was just the band looking around, moving all over the landscape to try to figure out where they're going to go now. Heritage is strange in that the individual songs that make up the album are so much better than the album itself. And I know that sounds weird, but if you try to sit down and listen to Heritage from start to end, you're left just a little bit confused with how to digest everything, because it just goes everywhere. But if you listen to the individual songs just on their own, they're very beautiful. So, after Heritage came out, and the band kind of had a time just kind of sit and reflect, they put out Pale Communion. Pale Communion is them stopping and just focusing their direction into one cohesive whole. This album feels more like an album than a group of songs that have just been collected. So what we have left is this really kind of a nod to that progressive rock scene from the very early 70s, mid to late 70s, as well as that acid rock that first came out, you know, the Deep Purple, the really early Black Sabbath, you know, those precursors to metal, you know, metal before metal really had a name. These guys are going way back, and I know that's kind of what Heritage was kind of doing, but Pale Communion was the one that really solidified that. It's a perfect blend between that acid rock and that progressive rock of that time. So after Michael had really looked around on the ground and really explored his own kind of techniques and really pushed it to the edge, he decided then to focus his effort onto what worked on Heritage and just go with it. And what was that? The progs. It's so pretty. Oh man, this thing is dripping in prog goodness. It feels like they've just kind of taken their repertoire of the progressive techniques and the progressive movements that they had in their previous albums and really developed them. Really dive into it. You've got the mellotrons, you've got the really badass organs, you've got the complex time signatures, the complex guitar works, the interplay between the organs and the guitars, and the interplays between the guitars and the guitars, and just the whole epicness. You're going on a journey on this album. And of course, it's just straight up Opeth. If you look at the songs, they're still dark. They're still just... It's really hard to explain outside just... It might not be those growling blast beats that were prominent in the early days, but it's still crazy heavy. It's one of the heaviest albums they've put out. That's really hard to say when you've got Blackwater Park, when you've got Still Life, when you even have Ghost Reveries, where those were dark albums. This guy, even though there's not the growling voices, that's compared with the dark atmosphere that this album really solidifies. Talking about mellotrons, organs, which are very prominent on this album, I had mentioned before that Opeth has gone through a lot of band member changes. This album really only lost one band member. That would have been Pierre Wilberg. And I hope I pronounced that right, because I probably didn't. He's been playing with Opeth since the Damnation Deliverance time, even though he really wasn't credited until Ghost Reveries. He left to be replaced by, and I'm going to mispronounce this, Joachim Selvberg. But I love his style. I love the atmosphere this guy creates. He might not be those riff tickling of the ivories that Pierre was, but he's definitely been able to really capture those moods and those atmospheres that Michael has been wanting to see in his albums. So the other thing that I really need to talk about this album is Michael's voice. Outside of the fact that he doesn't growl on this album, his voice shines. The amount of emotion that he's able to convey is just breathtaking. You can only convey so many emotions and so many moods when you're doing the death growls. But with a clean voice, with a clear voice, you're really able to pick up those subtle nuances. And this is really, really prevalent in songs like Voice of Treason, in songs like River, especially River at the end when he's just belting it out. You are feeling that. You're feeling it more than if he were growling at you. And even his work with the harmonies, it is just getting insane. Layer upon layer upon layer of vocals. He's doing 3, 4, 5, 6-part harmonies just with his own vocal range. And you know what's funny? I can't honestly say that I have a favorite track on this album. Unlike past albums when there was a clear favorite song, at least for me, this one has 4 songs, which is really hard to say when there's only 8 tracks on this. I mean, you've got Moon Above, Sun Below, River, Voice of Treason, and The Faith in Others. These 4 songs, at least for me, really shine on this album. So this album is dark. This album has some really dark atmosphere going on to it, and it is dripping in progressive rock. And I think there was another album that had done this previously early last year. But you know, for some reason I can't put my finger on it. I mean, it was dark. It was dripping in progressive rock, and it almost went back to that early 70s, mid-70s, where they're just experimenting with things, using different sounds, and really, but keeping that dark atmosphere, but I just can't put my finger on it. Oh well, it'll come to me. Well, if this is the direction that Opeth is going in, I am a huge fan of it, and I hope they continue with it. I am eagerly awaiting their next release while still soaking in all the juices from this one, because there's a lot to sink in. Alright, that's it. Notes out.